To keep yourself updated, subscribe to Indigo Learn and click the bell icon and download our app OneFin to start learning on the go.
Very simple standard. At the intermediate level, a very highly concentrated standard. And the first part of the discussion that we had, highly relevant for the intermediate people. But when you talk about CA final, the last part that we covered about the management's expert is the highly focused area. So overall, this standard plays a very important part of examiner's point that is very important for the examination as a whole. Having understood the entire standard in detail, it is now time for us to understand the standard in a summarized manner. This summary will enable you to understand the flow of the standard in a perfect direction. Alright, so we begin with SA 500 audit evidence. What is evidence? It is the information collected by the auditor for the purpose of drawing opinion on the financial statements. Now, when you talk about information, what constitutes an audit evidence is what we talk about in the standard. Evidence, we always use the word sufficient and appropriate, where sufficiency we connect it to the quantum and appropriateness refers to the quality. Quality means the audit evidence that you get or you collect should be relevant and it should be reliable. Relevant as in, for the appropriate assertion or for the appropriate transaction that you are checking, the data that you correlate to it should be relevant enough. For example, when you check the telephone expenditure, the corresponding invoices of the telephone or the telephone bills should be appropriately checked. So what information you collect should be relevant in the scenario. And reliability is what we talk about is more reliable. Only then we call it to be appropriate. So we have two terms, sufficient and appropriate, and sufficiency, the quantity simply talks about how much evidence should be obtained in order for us to draw a reasonable conclusion. Then we talk about is the reliability of the audit evidence. The concept of reliability tells that where will the auditor believe that the quality of the evidence would be better. Very simple to understand. First, external evidences will always be more reliable than the internal evidences. Evidences in the written form will be more reliable than the oral evidences. Evidence which the auditor will obtain directly will be more reliable than obtained through the client. Internal evidences would be more reliable only if the internal control systems are strong. And the last, we say that the original documents would be more reliable than the photocopies or the films or the digitized formats that we have. Alright, so this talks about the reliability. Now, understand when we have to perform the audit, performance of the audit is nothing but performance of the audit procedures. Why do we perform the procedures? To obtain the audit evidence. And what kind of evidence do we require? Sufficient, appropriate audit evidences. Now, when you talk about what procedures are we following, we broadly have two types of procedures. One we call it to be RAP, Risk Assessment Procedure, and the other we call FAP, Further Audit Procedure. Risk Assessment Procedure we will be doing by understanding the entity and its environment and will identify all the risky areas in this procedure. Then, based on the result of the Risk Assessment Procedure, we will then do the further audit procedures, that is, the compliance procedures and the substantive procedures. Compliance procedures we do for the test of controls, that is the internal control checking, whether they are present, if they are present, are they operating, and if they are operating, are they effectively operating throughout the year. Then we talk about substantive procedure, where we are going to do the test of details, where we check all the transaction and the account balances. Then, these are the procedures we follow to obtain evidence. Now, when these procedures are followed, what are the methods that we are going to use to follow these procedures? The first method we talk about is inspection, that is examination of the records, documents, tangible assets. Then we talk about observation, that is visually the auditor will be observing the process, the physical counting, etc. Then we have the recalculation, basically to check the arithmetical accuracy, where I gave you the example of depreciation calculation. Then we have the reperformance, where any of the procedure already performed by the client, you will reperform it just to ensure it is sufficient and appropriate evidence for you. Then you have analytical procedures, which will help the auditor to draw some kind of understanding of whether there is kind of unreasonableness between the data that is given. Then we have the external confirmation, where the auditor will be directly getting the responses from the external parties, which we will consider to be very reliable. Then we have the last one, which we call it to be an integral part of the audit, which is an inquiry which will be conducted. Inquiry is an integral part of the audit which will be conducted throughout the course of the audit. From the beginning of the audit to the end of the audit, continuously there will be a conversation struck by the auditor with every personnel in the organization. This inquiry could be either oral or it could be written. But the best part of the inquiry is that it would give an indicator to the auditor which he was not getting it while he was obtaining the other audit evidences. So there could be a possibility that a conversation with one of the employees gave you an idea of something which you were not able to get through the other evidences that you have obtained. So this is one of the very important things that you do as a part of the methods. So that is what inquiry. Now, the next part of the standard talks about inconsistency in the audit evidence. Meaning of this is, suppose for one particular item, the evidences that you have obtained are maybe 3 or 4 in number. But all the 3-4 evidences, different evidences that you have obtained are all giving you the different answer. Like for example, if you talk about inventory, when you look at the store's ledger, when you look at the accounts, inventory valuation, or when you look at the closing stock figure, or when you try to get some kind of confirmation from the creditors or the debtors for understanding the sales and the purchases, for us to do some kind of reverse calculation, all of these evidences which we corroborated together, they are not giving you an uniformity in the answers. So in that case, what happens is, we call it to be inconsistency. So here what happens is, the auditor will have to modify the audit procedure. So he has to check whether he requires to perform additional audit procedure to resolve the matter. Or is it required for him to increase the quantum of the evidences that he has obtained. This is possible when there is an inconsistency, or there is also possible if the auditor believes that the evidence that he has obtained is unreliable in nature. If suppose additional audit procedures also cannot be followed, in that case the auditor is going to think about what will be an impact on the opinion that he is going to give. The last part of the standard, which is considerably very important at the CA final level, is about the management expert. Management expert are those which have been employed or which have been hired by the management who are going to assist them in the preparation of the financial statement. But they are the experts other than experts in accounts and audit. For example, you could have an architect, you could have a chartered engineer, you could have an advocate, you could have a company secretary. It could be anybody or an actuary for that purpose who would help you in the valuation of certain items appearing in the financial statements. Now, there is a possibility that the auditor decides to use the work of the management expert. But because the sole responsibility of the opinion rests on the auditor, it is important for the auditor that before he uses the work or the information provided by the management expert for the purpose of serving it as an audit evidence, he has to do some kind of evaluation. So the evaluation that he will be doing is with respect to 3 things. First, we talk about the competence, the capability and the objectivity of the management expert. Second is we talk about is regarding how are we going to understand the work of the expert. Third, whether the expert's work is relevant or appropriate for the purpose of our audit. After understanding all the 3, we then come to a conclusion whether the information given to us by the expert, are we going to use it as a relevant audit evidence or not. Finally, there is also a possibility that the auditor could obtain information from some things which are within the organization. But when the information is obtained from within the entity, he has to double check it again. That means he will check the completeness, the accuracy of the information, and he will check whether it is precise and sufficiently detailed in order for him to use it for the purpose of audit evidence. Suppose if you take a purchase order, if the purchase order is not properly completed, if all the details are not properly appearing, then this purchase order will not prove or will not serve as a sufficient audit evidence. So this is all about SA 500 audit evidence, and as I told you, examination one of the highlighted areas. Having understood SA 500 audit evidence, let us now take up some questions for our better understanding, and with solving of these questions, you will get an idea what kind of questions we can expect in the examination. Alright. So with this, let us get started with the question number 1. So the first question that we take up is, CAN has been appointed as an auditor of Mazes Fabric Limited. In the course of audit, it has been observed that the inventory valuation, including WIP, was valued by the management by using the work of the experts hired by them. Analyze relevant factors to decide as to whether or not to accept the findings from the work of management expert in the valuation of inventory. So this has come in the May 18 new syllabus and it was for a 5-mark question. So the main examination question for 5 marks. Alright, now, as I told you, when it comes to CA final, usually a question from SA 500 is focused on the management expert part. So as we already discussed what a management expert is, just for a repetition, management expert is an expert other than expert in the field of accounts and audit, who has been employed or hired by the management, who will be helping the management in the preparation of the financial statement, right? Like we have done the examples of an architect or maybe an actuary, alright? So we have done examples like the lawyers, okay, will be helping you in the valuation of provision for maybe legal expenses, all of that. So these are all the experts that we were discussing. So it is a question based on that. So let us have an understanding of this question again. So it is CAN who has been appointed as the auditor of Fabric Limited, alright? Now what happened in the course of the audit? They were checking the inventory valuation, including WIP, and all of this they realized that it was valued by an expert. Okay, so the entire valuation was done by an expert, and who was this expert? Management expert. Now, analyze relevant factors to decide as to whether or not to accept the findings from the work of the management expert. Now here, the entire valuation that is appearing in the books of clients as a part of inventory valuation is being done by whom? A management expert. Like let us take the example, it could be maybe, okay, it's fabric, alright. So let us consider it to be something in textile and clothing. So maybe they could have employed or hired an expert who has done the valuation of the entire closing stock. Now in this case, tell me, the ultimate responsibility on the opinion will rest on whom? It is the auditor. So obviously, the auditor will not be accepting the work of the expert just like that. So as per SA 500, a very clear understanding is given to us that whenever we want to use the work of a management expert as an audit evidence for us, there is some procedure that we have to perform. So there are 3 things that we have to check. So what we will do is, when we get a work that is the management expert's work and we want to use it as an audit evidence, we need to do 3 checkings which are possible. The 3 things that we are going to check is, first, we will check the competence, the capability and the objectivity of this expert. So what are we going to check? The competence, that is the knowledge, capability, that is whether he is able to use the knowledge that he has in this particular direction appropriately, and the objectivity, whether he is unbiased or not. Is he independent in doing the valuation? Is it just giving it because of the relationship that he has with the client, or is this particular valuation really based on the certain facts? Alright, so we are going to check what? The competence, capability and the objective of the management expert. After that, we will try to understand the work. Understand as in we will see what are the accounting standards if they are applicable, which are the assumptions that he has used, reasonableness, if there is any law or regulation applicable. All of this we are going to check in order to understand the work that he has performed. Alright. Finally, we are then going to understand the appropriateness of the work. That means whatever calculation he has done, okay, whatever understanding he has obtained, what is the valuation that he has done, whether it is appropriately done or not. Okay, so all of this is what we have to check as the auditor. Appropriateness means the relevance. That is, I had given you the example of taxation. I told you if the provision of tax has to be checked, and if you want to understand what is the source from where he has done the calculation of tax, obviously it has to be the current budget, or it has to be the prevalent tax laws, or it should be the current tax rate. You cannot take something which is outdated. So it should be very much relevant for the purpose of your work. So all of these three checkings we'll be doing. Only then if we get an affirmative answer, we are going to use the work of the management expert. Otherwise, we will perform additional procedures and get an understanding of how is the valuation done. Now, the next question, which I've been discussing time and again, and I have repeated like almost n number of times. So I'm very sure every student will be very clearly understanding what is the question, and you will be in a position to even give the answer. So the question is, write a short note on the reliability of the audit evidence. Now we have done this so many times in detail. How do you understand whether a particular audit evidence would be reliable or not? Which are the audit evidences are the ones which we consider to be reliable? So we are going to have some kind of comparison done for the purpose of this answer. Why does reliability become so important for us is because the audit evidence that we obtain in the course of the audit has to be sufficient and has to be appropriate. And when we talk about appropriateness, it talks about two R's, that is, one is relevant and the other is what? Reliable. And that is the reason it becomes very important for us. Whenever we obtain audit evidence, they have to be reliable audit evidence. Now, how do you understand which evidence would be more reliable than the other? So, obviously, we have the comparison to be done. First, any evidence that we obtain from an independent source outside the entity would be more reliable than obtaining it from internal people. So, what is it? Independent source. Third party, outside the organization. Right? Then, second, again connected to the first one, external evidences are more reliable than internal evidences. Obviously, internal evidences, there is a highest scope of manipulation by the internal people. Correct? So, which are more reliable? External evidences would be more reliable than internal evidences. Third, internal evidences would be reliable if the corresponding internal controls are strong. That means we know in the audit we do what? Test of controls. So before moving on to substantive procedures to do test of details, we are going to first check the operating effectiveness of the internal control, which we call it to be what? Test of controls or the compliance procedures. So there you will be able to understand whether the internal control of the client is effective or not. And based on that, once you come to a conclusion that yes, the internal controls are good and they are operating effectively, then obviously we will be in a position to rely on the internal information. So only in those cases we say that the internal evidences could be more reliable if the internal control system is strong. Then, always understand written evidences are going to be more reliable than oral evidences. Written evidences are documentary, a written format, a statement. These will be taken by the auditor permanently. So obviously there is no scope for the other person to back out from the words that he had used. So inquiry is oral, but inspection is of the written documentation. We would consider always a written evidence to be more reliable than an oral evidence, because oral includes words spoken by a person who could back out anytime, right? He would deny tomorrow, I never told this. So in that case, we always believe what? Written evidences would be more reliable than what? Oral evidences. Fifth, audit evidences obtained directly by the auditor would be more reliable than obtained through whom? The management. So any evidence that you require, like for example, external confirmations. So this is what you are obtaining directly from the third party. These would be more reliable other than the one which you will tell the management to provide. Like for example, management provides you with a written representation, whereas you can obtain external confirmation, obviously which would be more reliable, the external confirmation. So what is obtained by the auditor directly would be more reliable than which we obtain from the management or through the management. So there could be some information which we want the management to collect. Okay, if we say tell the management, obtain the bank statement from the bank and give it to us. So it can obtain the bank statement, but while giving it to us, there could be a manipulation, right? So that would be less reliable when compared to directly obtained by the auditor. Last, tell me, in today's world, copying has become very easy, tampering has become very easy, duplicacy very easy, pirating very easy. So in that case, what we tell here also is same thing applicable. Always originality is better. So original documents will always be preferred over the photocopies or the digitized films, whatever you have. Anything which is filmed, photocopied, these would be less reliable. Xerox, all of these. Xerox and photocopy is obviously the same that we call it. Just for you to understand, or you would get an idea, photocopy and Xerox actually mean the same. Alright? So we believe in obtaining original documents from the client. We do not believe in the photocopies because originality is always better than what? Copies or the photocopies that you have. So this is the reliability of the audit evidence. So in this answer, you could have started with why you require reliability by giving the introduction to sufficiency and appropriateness. And then you could start giving answer of all the reliable points. That is when you obtain from the independent third party, more reliable. External evidence, more reliable than the internal. Internal would be reliable if the internal control is strong. Written evidences, more reliable than oral evidences. Obtained directly by the auditor, more reliable than obtained through the management. And obviously, original documents would be more reliable than that of photocopies or the digital films or any kind of duplicacy that you have done of the documentation. Because there is a scope of tampering, manipulation, which could not be apparent from the face of it. Alright, so this is the answer for short note on the reliability of audit evidence. The third question that we take up in the standard is obtain audit evidence or obtaining audit evidence in performing compliance and substantive audit procedures. Okay, comment. So they have given you a phrase or a sentence which tells obtaining audit evidence in performing compliance and substantive audit procedures. Now compliance procedures are test of controls. That is when the auditor is going to check how efficient is the internal control, whether the internal controls are present, if they are present, whether they are operating, and if they are operating, are they operating effectively during the year, is what we check as a part of the compliance procedures. And in the substantive procedures, we come after checking the internal control. If we understand internal control are highly effective, then substantive procedures would be low. And if the internal control is weak, obviously substantive procedures will be high, right? So compliance procedures are going to talk about the internal control system, whereas substantive procedures will be talking about A, B and C. Checking of account balances, okay, and class of transactions. That means you'll be checking the balance sheet items, you will be checking the transactions, and obviously the related disclosures to that. So this is test of details. So what we call it? Test of details. Alright. So this is the introduction that we can have for what is compliance procedure and what is substantive procedure. Now how do you obtain evidences while performing the compliance procedure and while performing the substantive procedure? So basically the question is talking about the methods for obtaining audit evidence, because the procedures are compliance and substantive. These procedures, when you apply, there are the methods to apply the procedure. So which are the methods that you are going to apply while performing these procedures for you to obtain audit evidence? So this we have done detailing in where? SA 500. So which are the methods? First, inspection of records, documents, tangible assets, okay, or maybe if you have internal control checking for the compliance procedure, then you'll be checking the standard operating procedures manuals. So you'll be having those documentation where you'll see how is the flow of work, how is the delegation of authority done. Okay, then you'll do the walkthrough just to understand whether all the internal controls are in place or not. Correct? So first is what? The inspection. Second we do is observation. Observation is what? Nothing but what is visualized by the auditor. So that could be done as a part of internal control, and that is also done while checking the assertions of the test of control. So for example, existence of a particular asset, you can observe it. Physical verification, observation. Internal control, you can just have a dummy entry passed and you can observe whether the processing is happening correctly or not. So that is observation, right? So first we have inspection, second we have is observation. Then we have external confirmation. This is basically for substantive procedures. Alright. So substantive procedures, we can also obtain evidences through the external confirmation, which we study as a part of 505. Then after external confirmation, we come to analytical procedures. So analytical procedures we could do for checking the sales, purchases, where we do a kind of reasonableness checking. So when you find anything unreasonable, unusual fluctuation, then we are going to apply additional audit procedures to check it. So one of the ways to obtain evidence would be performing analytical procedures. Then we do recalculation. Basically I told you depreciation, or maybe you could enter dummy transaction in a particular computer just to check whether the internal control is really there, whether calculation is really happening as per the said software by the client. Okay, so whether the controls are in place or not. Okay, then, or if you just want to see, can any person insert this particular data? So if suppose while you enter this dummy data, if the system is asking you to give a password, that means the control is strong. That means any person in the organization cannot bring in any extra data in the system. If you have to insert a data, add a data, you require entry through a password. So that is the control that you can check, right? Then that could come as a part of re-performance also, because about password would be re-performance only, because that is an internal control checking which you will re-perform and check whether it is happening or not. Alright? Risk assessment procedure of the entity. They have their own RAP, but can you 100% rely on them? No. So you will perform your own just to see whether you are able to assess the risk appropriately or not. Then last we talk about is the most important one, inquiry. Inquiry is going to happen throughout the audit. So be it the compliance procedure, whether testing of controls, or be it substantive procedure, test of details, everywhere we are going to have what? Inquiry. Inquiry is one of the fundamental aspects of conducting the audit. Every person in the organization we question. We try to get the answers from different level of the organization. These inquiries would serve a very important purpose for us to get an idea also that there is a risk of material misstatement. Sometimes the evidence that you obtained and the conversation that you had would contradict. Again, a doubt as to the reliability. Okay. So these are all what? A method through which we can obtain evidence in both compliance as well as substantive audit procedure. So when a question like this appears, you will be first explaining what is compliance, what is substantive, and then you could also, then you have to give the answer for methods of obtaining the audit evidence. So these are the methods. So once again for a reiteration, first is inspection, second observation, third external confirmation, fourth analytical review, fifth recalculation, sixth re-performance, seventh inquiry. So all of these are the methods that we are going to use in performing both substantive and compliance procedures to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So this is all about the question, obtaining audit evidence in performing substantive and compliance procedures.